All right. Happy Friday, everyone. It is 10 a.m. on the dot, and Michelle and I always like to get started on time and hopefully end on time. We're also happy to answer any questions throughout the webinar, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Today we're going to be talking about performance evaluations and guidance for employers. Today's topics include conducting evaluation. Performance evaluations or reviews are at their core a communication channel between employees and their supervisors. While primarily focused on evaluating employee performance and setting ongoing expectations, performance reviews should also give employees a chance to share their impressions of and expectations for their work situation. Ideally, that communication increases cooperation and understanding between supervisors and employees, thus enhancing both work performance and the work environment. These enhancements are reflected in better customer service and more engaged employees and improved overall organizational performance. So we are covering bonuses as well and top 5 evaluation mistakes that we see clients do as employment defense attorneys. Before we get started, we do have a disclaimer for you that content on this webinar should not be considered legal advice, although I do recognize a lot of names and I know a lot of our clients are on the call today. But communications made through this webinar and or by participating in it do not create an attorney-client relationship, although of course, Michelle and I are always happy to do so outside of this webinar. And then we are not responsible for any content that you may access from third-party resources that may be linked to this webinar. All right, so I'll get us started, and then Michelle and I are just going to go back and forth a little bit with functions of evaluations and conducting evaluations. Performance appraisals serve several functions, right? They evaluate an employee's status, they can encourage or change behavior, they can set goals and really make you in line with your employees. They can serve as a basis for rewards or corrective action. They can serve as a training or any development plans. And then they can create a detailed record of job requirements and performance. And conducting effective evaluations all contain the same format. In fact, Michelle, do you want to go over some key components?
So they all contain the same thing. They contain consistent standards, complete and accurate documentation, which we're going to talk about a little more later, which is really the purpose of this from a legal perspective. Open communication and honesty and fairness. Conversely, ineffective performance reviews can really cause a lot of problems. It can be perceived unfair treatment between employees, low morale, bad relationships between the employee and the employer or the employee and the supervisor. You can get mixed messages to employees, and then also gaps between what the employee thinks and what the supervisor or employer thinks. So the performance review is really about feedback. There's legal protections that we're going to talk about a little bit too, but it's really about feedback and a conversation about how much meaning and purpose a manager or an employer can create with an employee.
Right, and I think it goes both ways, right? Feedback to the employee and also feedback to the company from the employee.
Exactly.
So before we do a deep dive into performance evaluations, we'd like to first discuss why conducting evaluations is important and the benefit of having this type of written documentation. You know, one of the worst things a client can do is come to us and say, you know, I had this terrible employee working for me and I fired them last Friday. And well, okay, well, let's look at the personnel file and see what's in there. And there's absolutely no written documentation. In fact, oftentimes it's usually, you know, 5-star review after 5-star review, and there's not a lot in there. So no matter what type of employment litigation is at issue, whether it's a wage and hour claim, a leave issue, or a harassment claim, the amount of documentation an employer has dramatically increases the odds of prevailing in litigation. I may even go as far as to say there is a direct correlation between the likelihood of avoiding a devastating judgment and the amount of documentation the employer has regarding the particular employee or groups of employees involved in the litigation. And a lot of times I hear from our clients, you know, well, our our employees are like our friends, they're like a family, and that is great if you have that type of work environment, but it's important to document things even if they seem insignificant along the way. So what and how should employers document? We want to document significant conversations with employees, of course, any reviews, any days absent, and the reason for that absence, and any performance issues, whether they're good or whether they're bad. With email and the ability to scan documents or take pictures of documents on a phone, there's almost no excuse to not have everything documented. The only issue preventing employers from documenting issues is not stressing the need to do documents and the pressures of business, right? We're all trying to grow our businesses and succeed in our businesses, yet if we're not taking a step back and documenting any employee issues, it can come back to hurt us, whether it's a month from now, a year from now, or 2 years from now. We've had clients get sued after letting somebody go after 24 hours. We've had clients get sued after letting somebody go after 24 years. So it happens. So in addition, and what we're going to discuss today is that it helps to be reminded to conduct employee reviews routinely and accurately. The review will likely be the primary focus in a wrongful termination, a discrimination, or retaliation claim, and therefore the reviews should be accurate. It is hard to counsel employees on performance issues, but it is critical that these issues are addressed with employees in writing. So next, Michelle's going to dig into some of the details of the evaluation process.
Before I do that, I actually have an interesting anecdote about this. A former client of mine had a supervisor who kind of just phoned in evaluations. Cindy, I'm sure I've told you the story before. And so every year with this employee, he would just write like exceeds expectations. It was a little form and he just checked the box on exceeding expectations every year. Well, the employee ended up, and I've talked about this in the context of sexual harassment, but she ended up filing a sexual harassment claim against him. The supervisor had fixed a tag on her shirt one day, and she was very uncomfortable with that, filed a sexual harassment claim. Was that sexual harassment? Probably not. The problem is that after she filed this claim, he decided that he was going to now be honest on her reviews going forward. So the next review was pretty shortly after the sexual harassment claim was filed. And he decided, well, if she's going to do this to me, I'm going to be honest on her review. So everything was needs improvement, needs improvement, needs improvement. Had he just been honest in the past, which my understanding was she really did need a lot of improvement, but he was just sort of phoning in the evaluation process, we would not have been faced then with a successful retaliation claim with this employee. So that is a very good example of why phoning in performance reviews is never a good idea, because once something happens, you really need that accurate information in there. And had he been accurate before, there would have been no basis for a retaliation claim, but it was a successful retaliation claim and they spent a lot of money resolving it. So before we got to this next issue, I just wanted to touch on that.
No, but on that case in particular too, Michelle, it doesn't matter if the tucking in the tag in the back of a woman's shirt is actually successful in a sexual harassment claim. That does not matter. Yeah. What matters is he was now going to be honest and then opened himself and the entity up for liability.
Right. Just the fact that she filed the claim at all was the reason that it was retaliatory. So that's something to just keep in mind when you're doing this, is you want to be honest and fair, but the honesty and fairness needs to be accurate also. So moving on, we're talking about the purpose of evaluations, and it seems so basic, but it's really good to talk about this in detail. And whether you're conducting them annually or on a weekly check-in, they really give employers and employees a periodic opportunity to assess how well the employees' efforts are matching with their near and long-term goals. And they're also a chance to adjust those goals to ensure that they're continuing to align with any changes in the organization's priorities. So, while they're going to guide the development of training plans to maximize the employee's strengths and weaknesses, you can also figure out whether there's gaps that are really going to hold that employee back. And some organizations, some of my clients in particular, I know have separated performance reviews and compensation discussions. But the performance reviews really should correlate with that merit pay increase, and then any targeted bonuses that are based on performance, and with any promotions, right? So how do you conduct a review in a manner that will benefit both the employer and the employee? It really all starts with preparation.
So I was just saying, when you are preparing for an evaluation, make sure you review and update the employee's job description. You should do a detailed review at least once a year and anytime an employee's duties change. As part of a formal review, you should have the employee look at the description to assess whether it is accurate or still accurate. And you really can't provide a fair evaluation or usable feedback unless everyone understands and agrees what the employee's responsibilities are, right? And if the responsibilities have changed since the last performance review, revise the description and share the revisions with the employee before you provide any feedback. I think that's important, especially if you're, maybe running a little bit of a smaller company. In smaller companies, people tend to wear multiple hats and do different job duties throughout. They pick up where somebody else may not be able to finish, or something along those lines. And so I think it's important to make sure you start with the job description and make sure you have job descriptions in the first place.
Exactly. So the next thing is, take the time to assess whether the job functions that are in that job description and just what the employee is doing generally are still aligned with organizational needs. So you have to ask that tough question: do the reasons we created this position still exist? And that's a hard one, but it's something it doesn't mean that you're terminating people necessarily, but positions evolve, right? So you have to figure out if the tasks that are involved in this position contribute meaningfully to achieving the organizational short and long-term goals, or were they put in place to accomplish things that are no longer needed, or maybe even slow you down, right? So what duties do you eliminate, add in, re-emphasize? Those are all things to talk about before you do the review.
Right, and then you want to revisit how specific performance is measured. Performance should be evaluated according to established and agreed upon expectations, the list of specific outcomes that the employee knows you expect them to accomplish. Where appropriate, each of those outcomes should have a completion timeframe, and in most cases, the timeframe shouldn't be more than 12 months. And a lot of organizations use the term KPIs, which are key performance indicators. It's my favorite term. We have them in our office. I love KPIs. Everybody has, their key performance indicators, and that way it's a very clear measurable about whether or not someone is doing their job.
So the next thing you're going to do is assess any training and development needs. Employee goals should be fair, but they should be challenging. And in different industries, achieving some of them will require new or improved skills. So if an existing goal includes training, part of the review process will be checking the employee's progress towards completing the training and achieving those expected competencies. And if you're setting or resetting goals, be prepared to discuss what training will be needed. In our industry, that's not as much of an issue, but in a lot of industries, that's, especially as technology changes, that's something that's really important. So you need to discuss if that training is needed, deadlines for completion and required achievements, how the employee can access those needed training resources. And keep in mind that there's only so much time in a day, week, year, month, year. So employees will really have to accomplish training goals while also achieving their performance goals. So you need to be really realistic on those trainings.
And then prepare notes. That way everything is documented. Michelle and I always say the top 3 rules in employment law are document, document, and document. Accurate. So even if you're doing just a quick check-in, you should have at least a short list of items to discuss with the employee. It's also important to remind yourself that you need to be objective and fair, of course. You are assessing actual performance, not anticipated or potential work performance. It's also critical that you don't let any personal likes and dislikes get in the way of measuring actual performance. This has been really big in the last several years, actually, because we're now, all we're all linked through LinkedIn or Facebook or other social media sites, and you can get a sense of somebody's political views or religious views or things like that. So you can't let those personal likes and dislikes get in the way of measuring actual performance. And it isn't easy for any of us to always recognize personal prejudices, bias, or favoritism that might color an assessment. But remember, this is about more than just being fair. You also have an obligation to avoid getting your organization into serious legal trouble.
So next it's time to schedule the evaluation. And I know it sounds like we're walking through this in painful detail, but it's really important. The less formal check-ins and feedback sessions are typical of like continuous performance management, and those can happen nearly anywhere. Talking about the employee's desk or workstation, at lunch, or maybe on a walk around your office. Even though the location and discussion might be more casual, you need to keep some really basic things in mind. Any substantive, and this is the most important, any substantive performance discussion is really a private interaction between you and the employee. You need to watch your volume. Some people, when they get really excited, they talk really loud. I have a friend that does this. You need to be really aware of who's in earshot, and also avoid interruptions. So whether the discussion is going to take 5 or 20 minutes, don't answer your phone during it. Don't respond to a text unless it's truly like an emergency situation. And if you really must step away, be clear that you want to continue as soon as possible, and you need to make sure that that happens soon. If you're doing an informal discussion and it turns to a more sensitive topic or just needs more time, you can take a stop and reset, especially if you think things are escalating. And that might just mean saying, like, let's move this into the conference room, or let's schedule to pick this up at 3 p.m. or something like that. Just do it as soon as possible, because if you require a more detailed discussion, whether that's detail issue or a formal annual review, the next guidelines that we're going to talk about are really going to help you guys get the most value from the process and make it a good experience for everybody.
So, of course, choose a quiet place where you can both focus just on the evaluation. If possible, choose a neutral location. Obviously, it's a little different in COVID times where we're not always in person, but you want to meet privately, avoid interruptions, including telephone calls like Michelle mentioned. Making a point to turn off your phone will also tell your employees that the review is the most important task right now, and it'll just allow plenty of time. You don't want to feel rushed. Neither one of you wants to feel rushed, and you want to make sure you answer their questions and go over any of their concerns.
You want to discuss strengths and weaknesses. And if the employee is somebody that's worth keeping, you want a performance evaluation to keep them positive and engaged. And that really means acknowledging and encouraging high quality work, along with an honest assessment of where they need to improve. Nobody's perfect. Everybody can improve on something, right? So when you're discussing weaknesses, you need to be specific about what needs improvement and when those improvements must be made. And it also means that you have to be clear about the consequences for not making those improvements. So make suggestions of how to address those areas, ask the employee to propose steps that they think might help them achieve that required performance. And while it might not happen at the meeting, the evaluation is really not complete until you and the employee agree on timelines and specific actions to be taken to address performance issues. And that's, again, going to be industry specific, but it may mean that you have multiple conversations on one issue, and it's really that evaluation is not going to be complete until you do that. You're going to want to ask for the employee's input on new goals and Cindy's favorite KPIs. The more involved employees are in designing their jobs, the more committed they're going to be to achieving results. And again, it's not going to be a complete review until you guys agree on those new and continuing goals and how you're going to measure progress. One of the biggest pieces of advice I have on this is you, as the employer, you want to guide the conversation, but not dominate it. A major goal of performance reviews is to open an effective channel of communication between you and the employee. So let them do most of the talking. Don't interrupt them. Don't cross-examine them. You really need to be willing to listen and learn from the employee. So repeat what they tell you back to them and be sure that you understood what they said. But it shouldn't be a one-sided conversation, but just with you telling the employee how they did and this is what we see and not getting their feedback.
And then with written performance reviews, always include a few paragraphs explaining the manager's general assessment of how the employee's doing. It works best when managers take some latitude as to the content of this part. The assessment requires a general judgment on performance during the past year and a call to action for the future. It doesn't have to be the past year, but whenever the last performance review was. The written review should lay out a clear career path and let people know that their work is appreciated by their colleagues, their managers, the organization just in general. And managers may want to use some of these exact words when they are true to make employees feel good about themselves, their work, or their employer. It's good to characterize the review by opening the conversation, saying something like, this is mostly a positive review, or you've had a very good year. But remember, be careful. Sometimes managers want people to have an even better year next year, right? So for instance, it can never be the best ever, since that's always yet to come, right? A good way to do this is to build on what they already said in the review about liking the job and the people they work with. To be able to do this and insert the appropriate phrases in the written review, it is helpful during the verbal review to ask the employee what he or she or they like best about their job and then repeat that language. So Michelle's going to get into some specific items to address during this process.
So we have a few examples of things that you should address in the performance review, and then sort of what you could say about it, which again, we're digging in pretty deep here, but it's really good to have that. So like for attendance and punctuality, you can say something to the effect of, consistently arrives on time for work, meetings, training, development sessions, meets deadlines or provides sufficient notice when is unable to meet them. For productivity, something that like consistently exceeds production targets, has demonstrated significant improvement in achieving production targets since last review. For communication, effectively communicates with project teams and colleagues, escalates issues in a timely manner, needs to be clearer when communicating expectations. And for cooperation with other employees, collaborates effectively with team members to complete projects on time and at high quality, or has improved in seeking help when needed, needs to better support team members who ask for help or explanations in completing assignments. You don't have to use those exact words, but we thought it would be helpful to give examples. The next, actually, Cindy, if you want to bump to the next slide, I have a few more of them. So for problem solving, shows creativity and initiative when tackling complicated problems. If you're addressing flexibility, tends to resist new approaches and argue against needed changes. I've dealt with clients who have a lot of employees that do that. So you can also have somebody who adapts willingly and effectively to changing requirements. So these are just some examples. You want to acknowledge if somebody has a lot of drive, if they're seeking increased responsibility, if they are demonstrating, consistent leadership skills, strong efforts, and ethical professional behavior. You want to really be descriptive when you're describing the strengths and weaknesses of the employee when you're in the written evaluation process.
And just to add to this also, our firm has a list of core values. We have 4 core values. And we just internally hire, fire, and promote based on those core values. So when you're thinking about, whether the employee does great problem solving or has drive or flexibility or leadership, I also make sure just internally, and I would recommend this to other, to our clients as well, to go through your core values. And on our internal sheet, we bold them because they are core to us. And, is this person on our team communicating well? That is one of our core values. We want to make sure we communicate with you before you have to reach out to us and see where things are or what the status is on something. And so communication is a huge key value or core value for us. And so I always want to make sure that we're looking at our core values internally, and the attorneys and the support staff, going above and beyond in those specific core values that are most meaningful to our company. It's also really helpful to have a self-evaluation, to have your employees self-evaluate themselves in advance of a formal meeting. It offers opportunity for the employee to evaluate the employer as well. And so some ideas for questions here could be, what are your job responsibilities as you understand them? Rate and evaluate yourself on how you're doing in each area, and go one step further. How are you doing on the core values that we've agreed to in our company? What aspect of your performance are you most pleased with? What aspect of your performance do you think you need to work hardest on in the upcoming months? What skills do you want to improve most on, and how do you plan to do it? What help do you need there? And then what is one thing you are happiest about in your current work environment? Is there anyone on your team that you want to be working with more or less? I ask that question all the time just internally. What is one thing you are not so happy about and would like to change? And then how are we doing as a company in satisfying your needs? Are you feeling supportive? Do you have the right equipment? Those types of things can certainly help.
So when you're addressing goals and potential problem areas with the employee, or maybe there's a change in job duties and you're preparing them to take on additional responsibilities, you really want to create within the review process a development plan. It's just critical to increasing the employee's value to the organization and then the organization's ability to achieve those strategic goals. So whether it's coming out of like a continuous review process, which I know a lot of businesses are going to that, or just like a traditional annual assessment, you want to make sure that your development plan for the employee has really specific objectives. You want to identify long-term goals, that's like 5+ years, as well as short-term goals, like 1 to 5, sometimes shorter, 6-month goals, and career steps that will help them achieve long-term goals. You want to agree on what specific steps they're going to be taking, whether it's specific training, certain project assignments, all of those things that might help them achieve those short-term goals, and prioritizing those steps for the employee. You don't want the employee to leave and be like, I have all this stuff I need to do and I don't know how to do it, or where to do it, or when to start. So you really want to prioritize those with the employee, and then set firm target dates for completion of each action step, as well as defining specific tasks, and schedules that are needed to accomplish each step. So many of these goals, steps, and tasks are going to be shared across teams and potentially other employees, but most of them really need to be laser focused to the individual employee. And no matter the specific components of this process that you incorporate, the most important step is going to be that goal setting. And it's really imperative that the employee knows exactly what is expected of their performance, and your periodic discussions that you have over the course of that next time frame, whether it's a year or less, about performance need to focus on these significant portions of the employee's job and the goals required to get there.
We have clients that do evaluations once a year with their employees, twice a year, or even quarterly, or even Michelle mentioned weekly sometimes if somebody might be on a performance improvement plan, or a new employee, right? You want to make sure you onboard them correctly and carefully, and that they know their expectations. And it doesn't always have to be this formal 1-hour sit-down process, right? I mean, we definitely recommend that once a year to go over everything in great detail. But sometimes it could be, let's just take a 15-minute walk together, right? Or do something to make sure that we are aligned, between the company and the employees.
Absolutely. So next, I'm going to talk about, once you get through that process, a lot of times when people are in the performance evaluation, that's the time when they're discussing bonuses and merit compensation increases. The biggest one that people get confused about is bonuses. So Cindy was going to talk about that next.
Yeah, and so with a discretionary bonus is such that both the existence of the payment as well as the amount of the payment are determined at the sole discretion of the employer, not pursuant to any prior contract, agreement, or promise which would create or cause the employee to expect such payments. Payment is made when the employer decides to issue the payment. That is discretionary. It's completely up to the supervisor, manager, owner, whatever, the business, right? A non-discretionary bonus is an extra wage paid for extra service performed by the employee and is usually based on a promise to pay if the services are performed. The extra services may be measured by an incentive plan, hours worked, or other special performance. In this case, the bonus appears as non-discretionary and must be treated as part of the regular rate of pay. The bonus must be paid in the payroll period when earned. If the employee is terminated, the non-discretionary bonus must be paid according to final pay requirements, which is generally, if you let somebody go or, fire somebody, you pay them in full for that time period. In addition, non-discretionary bonuses must be factored into the regular rate of pay for the purposes of overtime calculations for your non-exempt employees. The calculations depend on a specific set of factors, including whether it is a flat sum or production bonus. So if you do give out non-discretionary bonuses and you have an employee working overtime, we just highly recommend you speak to legal counsel on those specific calculations so you're not shooting yourself in the foot later. It's a big mistake we see companies make. And the regular rate of pay is extremely important to understand because it impacts other issues aside from the actual bonus and overtime. It even impacts the amount of premium pay owed to workers who miss meal or rest periods. Now, there was a case, we call it the Lowe's case, but basically a bartender filed a class action complaint alleging that the employer failed to properly pay premiums for non-compliant meal and rest periods, or meal periods and rest breaks, because it omitted non-discretionary incentive payments, such as bonuses, from that calculation. The lower court sided with the employer, ruling that the base rate of pay should be used. However, the California Supreme Court ruled that the extra pay must be calculated at the employee's regular rate of pay, which is the formula used to determine overtime premiums under the state labor code. This is the formula that incorporates non-discretionary bonuses. So it's very important to understand these issues clearly if you are offering non-discretionary bonuses to employees at any time.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how important that is to understand, and it's complicated. It's a complicated calculation. That's why we're not even talking about the calculation here, because everybody's eyes would be sort of spinning. It's a lot, but if you need help with it, we're happy to help you. So part of a supervisor's responsibility in conducting performance reviews, as we said, is protecting your organization from serious legal problems. And how a performance review is conducted and documented can really win or lose a lawsuit if an employee sues for discrimination or wrongful termination. So we thought it would be helpful to talk about the 5 biggest mistakes we see people make in the evaluation process. And this doesn't mean we're seeing it when you're doing the evaluations. Often we're seeing it down the road when we're defending your wrongful termination or discrimination case. So the first one is failing to sync a written review with verbal comments. And that really, unfortunately, sometimes you'll have something all written down and then everything that you're talking about is completely different. So what this does, unfortunately, is it really decreases the reliability of the documentation that you're maintaining. We're happy if you have documents, those are good. But if it turns out that what you told the employee during that review is not consistent with what's in the documentation, it really decreases our ability to rely on it and opens the business up to potential loss.
Another mistake we see, failing to document performance reviews in the first place thoroughly, right? While it's fine to have informal discussions, you should always follow up informal discussions with an email to confirm the discussion or take copious notes during the formal reviews. It's an important thing. And like I said, it doesn't, not every review has to be a full 1 hour formal, let's sit down and face each other and go over everything. But even those things that you can talk about with your employees, while you're getting a cup of coffee or getting some water, it could be used to just any sort of documentation, even if it's just an email to yourself. Hey, I just sat down with, Emily in the office and I gave her a brief note of to do this differently next time, or she was late, or whatever that is that you want to document.
Well, and the problem is when you don't do that, but you have, and this is the example that I was talking about earlier, when all you have is a performance review document that's just sort of filled out and there's nothing else, everything decreases reliability. And so you really have a problem if all you have are things that are not reliable or things happen differently than were then were actually documented in the documents that you have, everything decreases that reliability. So we want the documents that you give us to be accurate, and we want them to be reliable when we're defending you down the road, if and when. So making sure that you're documenting everything is really important.
Well, and employees come and go, right? I mean, just because someone has been with you for a number of years doesn't mean they'll always be with you should a lawsuit arise. So making sure you have copies of their notes is key.
Yeah, Cynthia and I have a client who we were defending a wrongful termination wage and hour case. And the employee was awful, like awful employee. And this employer actually did some performance reviews, but again, was just sort of phoning it in. Occasionally would put that he needed improvement here and there. But the biggest issue they had with this employee, and there was no documentation of it at all, is that he was showing pornography to other employees in the break room. And I believe that it happened. There were multiple people who experienced it. There were some discussions about it, but there was nothing on the day that it happened when this whole thing was happening with the employees and talking to him. There was no documentation of it. So for us to use that as a reason for terminating him, is it a legitimate reason to terminate somebody? Absolutely. Was there any documentation of it? No, none. So it was really difficult when we were mediating the case to rely on that, because everything else had been documented except that, which was just not great.
Well, and one point on that too is those employees who witnessed it may not be working for you 3 years from now, right?
This was a high turnover business.
Like the number one thing we always hear from clients is, well, I have witnesses, I can get declarations. And yes, we can absolutely do that. It just takes so much more time to get there, right? If you have a clear personnel file with all the problems, including showing porn in a break room, that is much better than trying to go back and say like, hey, Michelle, let's interview this person. What happened 3 years ago? Do you remember the date? Do you remember the circumstances or the specifics about it? And people's memories fade, of course. Obviously, something like that will probably stick a little bit stronger than other things of, an employee showing up late every day or what days that they showed up late, things like that. But by the time you are in litigation and, you need it on the record, you're taking depositions of those people who witnessed it, and that can just be a very costly process. So,
absolutely. Well, and the thing to consider too is if that's in the employee file, often in these cases, before anybody files anything, we get a request for employee records. If I can put that he was disciplined and terminated for showing pornography in the break room on the top of that pile, that's going to really decrease the likelihood that a plaintiff's employment attorney is going to take that case at all. So, I mean, if I saw that come in and we were doing plaintiff's employment cases, I would be like, maybe like hard pass on that one, because that's going to be hard to prosecute, right? So consider that these are things that are provided to employee counsel before litigation even takes place, and can maybe head it off.
Right.
Or get it resolved very cheaply, right?
Right. A personnel file can certainly discourage plaintiff's counsel from filing a lawsuit. And we've written letters back multiple times, and that's what happened, right? We don't hear from them again. It's fabulous, but it really depends on the documents.
So this gets into the number 3 mistake, not giving specifics about what the employee did well or what they needed to improve on. In addition to the things that we just talked about, it really minimizes the effectiveness of the review process. The employee needs to know specifically what they're doing well and what they need to improve on. So if you're not doing that, if you're just sort of generally saying, oh yeah, you're doing great, everything's great, that's not going to be an effective review.
And then failing to be fair and honest, giving inflated ratings to avoid difficult conversations or hurting a worker's feelings, or basing ratings on factors that are not included in the job description and performance plans can be huge mistakes. They prevent a fair and honest review, right? So the problem here is that if the review is not reliable, the documentation really serves no purpose in litigation. And we are always coming at it in looking out for your best interest in saying like, okay, if this goes to litigation, how is this going to look? What can we do today to prevent that from happening?
All the time. So the number one that we see is really failing to follow your internally established review procedures and timelines. So this goes back to what we mentioned in the very beginning, is that employers not having documentation is a huge deficiency in defending any claims against employees, but most important for this is the wrongful termination or discrimination claim. So if you're not doing any sort of reviews and you want to terminate somebody, the first thing I say is, have you documented these issues, these performance issues? A lot of times the answer is no. And so it makes it really challenging if you end up terminating an employee and they think it's a pretext for some sort of discrimination, or they believe that they're being terminated for some sort of other illegal reason. If you don't have the documentation and have not followed your own procedures and timelines for doing reviews, it makes defending it really, really hard. So the biggest tip that we can give you today is do the reviews. Do them annually, do them every 6 months, whatever you want to do, at least on an annual basis. You need to do them and be honest on them.
And then really, no matter who you use as an employment attorney, whether it's our firm or another firm, make sure you're checking in with them before you do anything, before you fire somebody. You know, we recommend really at least 2 check-ins a year, because there's so many changes that come out with employment law. I mean, minimum wage is going up again January 1st. We have all the COVID protocols in place that keep changing. Speaking of which, we are doing another webinar on December 15th, and it'll be my last webinar for a while. Michelle and I like doing these once a month for our clients and our friends, but I'm actually giving birth in a few weeks. So we'll get back on track next year, but you know, just make sure you're checking with your employment attorneys, and make sure they have an experienced team of attorneys behind them, right? I mean, everybody at this firm has 11 to 20 years of legal experience, most notably defending business owners only, and then do an early liability assessment, right? And what I mean by that is, if you have a potential employee who is a little bit of a red flag, you know, they're doing any things we talked about today, it's important to see, you know, how does their personnel file look? And have they signed all of their employment documents, right? Have they received the employee handbook and signed an acknowledgement form on that? Have you dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's, basically? So some helpful things. And then if you haven't gotten it, we do have a general employment compliance checklist. I'm happy to send that to anybody who wants it. My email address is at the bottom of just about every slide. And, you know, we like to be highly communicative with our clients, our employees, our friends, our audience members. So if you'd like to stay in touch, you can text HF Law to 66866. Stay up to date with any news regarding employment law and how it might affect you and your business. You can access any, I come out with checklists every time, or as often as I can, actually. And then, Michelle, we're actually getting a question about arbitration agreements, because that is a hot topic right now too, and AB 51.
Do you want to type your email address in there and we can get back to you on that, just since we're almost to the end on this?
We are at the tail end right now. If our arbitration agreements have been a little bit tricky over the last few years. So
it's in flux is my general answer. it's a
right.
little bit, we would probably need to talk to you a little more specifically about it, but because the issue is in flux, it's really a challenge. You can always use them, but just with the understanding that there's the possibility that they will not be enforceable.
Right. And so, you know, you don't want to force any of your employees to sign one, but if they voluntarily sign an arbitration agreement, that's great.
And do it as a separate standalone document if you're going to be using them right now, because you wouldn't want to invalidate your entire employment contract if you have one.
Right. Always separate standalone document. Absolutely. All right. So that is it for today. You can always keep in touch. We're in Pasadena, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Thanks for joining us.